I spent my entire life trying to buy my parents' love. For their 50th anniversary, I handed them the keys to a $425,000 oceanfront sanctuary. Instead of tears of joy, they committed a betrayal so deep it shattered our family and ignited a brutal, undeniable wave of karma. In every family, there is an unspoken hierarchy. In mine, the hierarchy was broadcasted in high definition, illuminated by neon signs, and carved into stone. My older brother, Thomas, was the sun, and my parents, Aidan and Beatrice, were the planets revolving endlessly in his orbit. I, Stella, was Pluto distant, cold, and eventually downgraded from planetary status altogether. Growing up in a modest suburb of Philadelphia, money was always tight, but somehow, there was always enough for Thomas. When Thomas wanted to attend a premium baseball camp, my parents remortgaged the house. When Thomas totaled his first car 3 days after getting his license, my father simply patted his shoulder, grateful his boy was safe, and bought him another one. Meanwhile, I wore Thomas's oversized hand-me-down winter coats and paid for my own college tuition by working double shifts at a diner. I wasn't resentful, at least. I told myself I wasn't. I just assumed that if I worked hard enough, became successful enough, and proved my worth, my parents would eventually look at me with the same starry-eyed adoration they reserved for my brother. Fast forward 20 years. I had built a highly lucrative career as a commercial real estate developer. My husband, Henry, and I lived comfortably. We were child-free by choice, dedicated to our careers, and financially secure. Thomas, on the other hand, was a 40-year-old entrepreneur whose ventures consistently imploded. There was the artisan dog food bakery that lasted 3 months, the crypto mining operation that burned through my parents' retirement savings, and the luxury watch import business that ended with a quiet settlement to avoid fraud charges. Through it all, Aidan and Beatrice never wavered. Thomas is just finding his footing, my mother would say, sipping her tea in her faded armchair. He's a visionary, Stella. People like him take longer to bloom. As my parents' 50th wedding anniversary approached, I saw an opportunity. Not just an opportunity to celebrate them, but to finally, definitively, win their approval. I wanted to give them something Thomas never could. I wanted to give them peace, luxury, and a tangible proof of my success and devotion. I found it in Cape May, New Jersey. It was a beautiful, slightly weathered Victorian cottage sitting just 2 streets back from the ocean. It was listed as an estate sale, a fixer-upper with good bones. I bought it in cash for $250,000 and spent the next 8 months pouring $175,000 into high-end renovations. We installed a chef's kitchen with Carrara marble, restored the original wraparound mahogany porch, and built a master suite on the ground floor so my aging parents wouldn't have to navigate stairs. The total investment was $425,000, but the appraised value was already climbing. I poured my soul into that house. I picked out the nautical-themed drawer pulls, the exact shade of sea glass blue for the guest room, and even stocked the wine fridge with my father's favorite full-bodied reds. Henry, bless his patient heart, watched me with a mixture of love and deep concern. "Stella," he said one evening as I was obsessively tracking a shipment of custom Adirondack chairs for the porch. "It's a beautiful thing you're doing. But you have to manage your expectations. A house isn't a time machine. It's not going to rewrite 35 years of family dynamics." "You don't understand," I replied, brushing off his concern. "When they see this, they'll see me. They've spent their whole lives worrying about money and worrying about Thomas. This is a sanctuary. Once they are sitting on that porch, listening to the waves, everything will change." I genuinely believed it. I envisioned the tears in my mother's eyes. I pictured my father pulling me into a rare, tight embrace, finally telling me how proud he was of the woman I had become. I spent nights crying happy, preemptive tears at the thought of finally being enough. The plan was simple. I had invited them to Cape May under the guise of renting a nice Airbnb for a private family weekend to celebrate their golden anniversary. Just the 4 of us, plus Thomas. I would cook a beautiful dinner, pop a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon, and hand them the deed. I should have listened to Henry. The weekend of the anniversary arrived, bringing with it a crisp, perfect coastal breeze. Henry and I drove down a day early to make sure everything was flawless. The house smelled of fresh paint, sea salt, and the roasted garlic chicken I had slow cooking in the oven. At precisely 2 p.m., a sleek, unnecessarily loud, black Range Rover pulled into the freshly paved driveway. It was Elise, of course, Thomas's latest attempt to look the part of a wealthy mogul. My parents emerged from the back seat, looking a little cramped but beaming. I rushed out to the porch to greet them. "Happy anniversary!" I practically shouted, throwing my arms around my mother. Beatrice gave me a brief, one-armed squeeze. "Thank you, darling." The drive was dreadful, but Thomas navigated the traffic so expertly. He really has such wonderful spatial awareness, doesn't he? I swallowed the sudden lump in my throat. "Yes, Mom. Come inside. Look at the place." They walked up the steps. Aiden looked around, whistling low. "Nice rental, Stella. Must be costing you and Henry a pretty penny. You shouldn't throw your money away on things like this, though. A weekend is fleeting. Real estate is where the smart money is." Henry caught my eye and gave me a supportive nod. "Just wait," his look said. Thomas swaggered in behind them, tossing his designer sunglasses onto the pristine marble kitchen counter. "Not bad, sis. A little quaint for my taste, but it does the job. Is there decent Wi-Fi? I'm waiting on a massive wire transfer from an investor in Dubai." We spent the afternoon on the porch. I poured the wine, I served the hors d'oeuvres, and I listened to my parents praise Thomas for a full 2 hours. They talked about his potential and how unfair the market had been to him. Not once did they ask how Henry and I were doing, or how my firm had just secured a major downtown development contract. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Cape May sky in brilliant strokes of tangerine and violet, I decided it was time. I couldn't wait any longer. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Mom, Dad, could you come into the living room for a second?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. They obliged, taking a seat on the plush, white linen sofa I had specifically chosen for my mother's comfort. Thomas leaned against the doorframe, swirling a glass of my expensive wine, looking bored. I stood in front of the fireplace, holding a beautiful, custom-engraved mahogany box. 50 years is an incredible milestone," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "You both sacrificed so much when we were growing up. You worked hard, you stretched every dollar, and you always made sure we had a roof over our heads. For the last 10 years, you've talked about how much you wanted to retire by the water, but you never felt you could afford it." My mother smiled politely. My father looked confused. "Well," I continued, stepping forward and placing the mahogany box on the coffee table in front of them. "You don't have to worry about affording it anymore. I didn't rent this house for the weekend. I bought it. I spent the last 8 months renovating it. It's fully paid off. No mortgage, no strings. Happy 50th anniversary. Welcome home." Silence descended on the room. It was thick and absolute. Only the distant sound of crashing waves filtered through the open windows. Slowly, Beatrice reached out and unlatched the box. Inside, resting on a bed of velvet, were 2 shiny brass keys and a thick manila envelope containing the property deed and transfer paperwork. She picked up the keys. She looked at them, then looked at the envelope. I waited for the gasp. I waited for the tears. I waited for the embrace that would wash away 35 years of feeling invisible. Instead, my mother turned her head. She looked past me, her eyes locking onto my brother leaning against the doorframe. Her face didn't register joy, it registered calculating relief. "Oh, Aiden," she breathed, her voice completely devoid of the emotion I had anticipated. "Look at this." My father leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He looked at the deed, then looked up at Thomas. A slow, broad smile spread across his weathered face. "Thomas, my boy," my father said, his voice booming with pride. "Come here." Thomas pushed off the door frame and sauntered over. Beatrice picked up the manila envelope and the keys. Without a second glance at me, she held them out to my brother. Tommy, sweetheart, this is the answer to our prayers. You were just saying how you needed collateral to secure the loan for your new logistics company. This is a $425,000 asset. You can leverage this, or even flip it. With the market right now, you could have your seed money by next month. The air in my lungs vanished. The ground felt like it was tilting beneath my feet. Wait, I choked out, stepping between them. Mom, Dad, what are you doing? My father looked at me, his expression hardening into one of mild annoyance, as if I had just interrupted a crucial business meeting. Stella, please. Lower your voice. We are making a practical family decision. Practical? I shrieked, the carefully constructed facade of the successful, put-together daughter shattering instantly. I bought this house for you. I spent $425,000 of my own money, hours of my own sweat, to give you a place to retire. And you're handing it to Thomas to fund another one of his imaginary businesses? Thomas scoffed, snatching the envelope from my mother's hands. Imaginary? It's a disruptive supply chain model, Stella. You just don't understand high-level venture capitalism. And besides, Mom and Dad don't need a huge house to maintain. They're fine where they are. You already have a beautiful home, Stella, my mother added, her tone suddenly frosty and defensive. You and Henry have more money than you know what to do with. You don't need this. Thomas is struggling. Family helps family. You should be happy that your gift is going to save your brother's future. My gift, I whispered, the devastation giving way to a white-hot, blinding rage, was for you. It was a home. It wasn't an ATM for the golden child. Don't you speak about your brother that way, my father shouted, standing up. We are your parents. You gave us a gift, and it is ours to do with as we please. If we choose to invest it in our son, that is our right. You are incredibly selfish to try and dictate how we use our own property. Selfish. The word hit me like a physical blow. After a lifetime of taking a back seat, after emptying my savings to buy their dreams, I was the selfish one. I looked at Henry. He was standing near the hallway, his face pale, his jaw clenched tight in fury. He took a step forward, ready to intervene, but I held up a hand. I looked at my mother, who was already discussing with Thomas how quickly a real estate agent could get the house listed. I looked at my father, who was nodding along, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just ripped his daughter's heart out and handed it to a grifter. Fine, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. You're right. It is your gift. You can do whatever you want with it. I turned on my heel, grabbed my purse from the kitchen island, and walked toward the front door. Stella, where are you going? My mother called out, sounding more annoyed than concerned. Dinner is in the oven. Enjoy the house, I said without looking back. Henry followed me out the door, the screen slamming shut behind us, echoing like a gunshot in the quiet coastal air. As we drove away from Cape May, the silence in our car was suffocating. I didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It had bypassed sadness and solidified into pure, unadulterated ice. They thought they had won. Thomas thought he had just scored the easiest payday of his life. My parents thought they had finally secured their golden boy's future using my hard work. But, as I sat in the passenger seat, watching the ocean roll by, a dark, vindictive realization settled over me. In their greed, in their rush to hand over the keys to Thomas, they had failed to look closely at the paperwork inside that mahogany box. They had the keys. They had a deed. But they didn't have the whole truth. And karma was about to collect. The drive back to Philadelphia was a study in absolute, ringing silence. Henry kept throwing worried glances my way, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, but I just stared out the window at the highway lines blurring past. I wasn't in shock. Strangely enough, I felt lighter. The desperate, exhausting 35-year quest for my parents' validation had been surgically excised from my chest. In its place was a cold, impenetrable clarity. When we finally walked into our own house, Henry dropped our overnight bags in the foyer and poured us both a generous glass of bourbon. He handed me one, his brow furrowed in deep concern. Stella, he started gently, we can call my college buddy, the litigator. We can challenge the transfer. We can prove they accepted the gift under false pretenses. I held up a hand, taking a sip of the amber liquid. It burned on the way down, a grounding sensation. Henry, we don't need a litigator. He blinked, confused. What are you talking about? They practically spat in your face and handed a $500,000 asset to Thomas. He's going to squander it by Halloween. He can't squander what he doesn't own, I said, walking over to my briefcase and pulling out a duplicate folder of the paperwork I had left in the mahogany box. I tossed it onto the kitchen island. Read it. Henry opened the folder, scanning the dense legal jargon. His eyes widened as he flipped to the second page. A slow, incredulous smile began to form on his lips. You didn't, he whispered. I did, I replied, leaning against the counter. I love my parents, Henry, but I am not an idiot. I work in commercial real estate. I know exactly how predatory Thomas is. I knew the second I gave them a house, Thomas would start sniffing around, trying to convince them to leverage it for his next brilliant venture. So, I had my corporate attorney, Simon Caldwell, draft a very specific type of deed. Henry read aloud, his voice dripping with triumphant disbelief. The grantor, Stella Bennett, hereby conveys a life estate in the property to Aidan and Beatrice Gallagher. The grantees shall have the right to occupy and enjoy the premises for the duration of their natural lives. The grantees may not sell, transfer, sublet, or encumber the property with debt. Upon the death of the last surviving grantee, full ownership and fee simple title shall revert immediately to the grantor. He looked up at me, practically beaming. It's a life estate. They don't own the house. They just own the right to live in it until they die. Exactly, I said, a grim satisfaction settling over me. The envelope contained the life estate deed, a copy of the property tax escrow account I funded, and the HOA rules. I wanted to protect my gift from Thomas so they could actually have a peaceful retirement. I guess they were in such a rush to hand him the keys, they didn't bother reading the terms and conditions. For the next 3 weeks, I went completely no contact. My phone was silenced to their numbers. According to social media, Thomas was living his best life. He posted a photo of himself leaning against the Cape May porch railing with the caption, "New acquisitions. Big moves coming. Number real estate mogul number. Generational wealth." I actually laughed out loud in my office when I saw it. The inevitable explosion happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the middle of a Zoom call with city planners when my cell phone began vibrating off the desk. The caller ID flashed. Sylvia Brentwood. Sylvia was one of the most ruthless, high-end real estate brokers in the Cape May area. I had met her a few times at industry galas. I excused myself from the Zoom meeting and answered. Sylvia, to what do I owe the pleasure? Stella, darling, we have a rather awkward situation, Sylvia said, her crisp, patrician voice tight with annoyance. A man named Thomas Gallagher is sitting in my office. He claims to be your brother. He wants to list the property you just finished renovating on Ocean Avenue. He's demanding an expedited cash sale and is already trying to negotiate my commission. Is that so? I murmured, thoroughly enjoying this. Yes. However, my title company just pulled the records. The property is held in a life estate. He brought in a signed transfer of deed from your parents, but it's completely legally void. They have no right to sell. I tried explaining this to him, and he had a complete meltdown in my lobby. He's currently screaming into his cell phone, out on the sidewalk. Right on cue, a second call started coming through on my phone. It was my father. Thank you, Sylvia, I said smoothly. Please have security escort him off your premises. He has no legal standing regarding that property. I clicked over to my father's incoming call. Hello, Dad. Stella, what the hell kind of game are you playing? Aidan's voice was a booming roar of indignation, crackling through the speaker. Thomas is at the realtor's office. They're telling him the deed is fake. They're saying he can't sell the house. The deed isn't fake, Dad, I replied, my voice dangerously calm, the temperature of absolute zero. It's a life estate deed. I bought that house so you and Mom could retire comfortably without paying a mortgage. I specifically structured it so Thomas couldn't steal it from you. But it seems you were eager to help him steal it anyway. How dare you? My mother shrieked in the background. She must have been on speakerphone. You lied to us. You gave us a defective gift. You deliberately humiliated your brother. I gave you a sanctuary. I fired back, my voice finally rising, the years of suppressed anger breaking through. You threw it away without even reading the paperwork. The only person humiliating Thomas is Thomas. The house belongs to me. You have the right to live there, rent-free, for the rest of your lives. But Thomas isn't getting a dime. Do not call me again. I hung up and blocked their numbers. The trap had snapped shut. But I had no idea just how catastrophic the fallout was about to be. Karma is rarely a swift executioner. It does not often arrive with a sudden crash of thunder or a cinematic explosion. Instead, it operates more like a patient, methodical auditor, silently tallying up years of arrogance, entitlement, and blind enabling until the debt becomes too massive to ignore. Over the next 6 months, the delicate house of cards Thomas had built and that my parents had so zealously reinforced with their unconditional devotion collapsed with spectacular, devastating violence. Because I had strictly enforced a no-contact boundary, blocking their numbers and filtering their email addresses directly to my spam folder, I experienced the fallout from a distance. The details trickled in through a network of extended family gossip, specifically a lengthy, revealing lunch with my Aunt Patricia. Patricia was my father's younger sister, a no-nonsense retired school principal who had spent the last 3 decades silently judging Aiden and Beatrice's suffocating favoritism. You wouldn't believe the absolute circus it has become, Stella, Patricia told me over a niçoise salad one brisk October afternoon, her voice a mix of morbid fascination and profound pity. Thomas is drowning, and he's dragging your parents straight down to the bottom of the ocean with him. As it turned out, Thomas's frantic, aggressive push to sell the Cape May property wasn't merely about securing seed money for a visionary new logistics company. He was already drowning in a terrifying ocean of high-interest debt. Nearly a year prior to my parents' anniversary, Thomas had taken out a staggering $300,000 short-term bridge loan. He hadn't gone to a traditional bank, of course. His credit score was practically radioactive. Instead, he had secured the funds from a private, predatory lending syndicate headed by a notoriously ruthless financier named Victor Sterling. Thomas had fed Sterling a fabricated story, complete with forged financial documents, claiming he was the primary beneficiary of a massive, soon-to-be liquidated family trust. Thomas didn't invest that $300,000 into a business. He used it to fund the illusion of success. He paid off aggressive bookies from a disastrous stint with offshore sports betting, he prepaid a year's lease on that obnoxious black Range Rover, and he rented a penthouse apartment downtown to host investor dinners that were nothing more than elaborate fronts to con new marks out of their cash. When Victor Sterling's deadline arrived, carrying an exorbitant, suffocating interest rate, Thomas panicked. He had banked everything on flipping the anniversary gift. When Sylvia Brentwood's title company revealed that the house was locked tight in an impenetrable life estate, Thomas didn't just lose a 6-figure windfall. He defaulted on a loan to the kind of dangerous people who do not accept apologies, extensions, or excuses in lieu of payment. Sterling's associates began showing up at Thomas's favorite high-end restaurants. They left threatening voicemails. The illusion was shattering. Desperate, cornered, and entirely out of options, Thomas deployed his most reliable, time-tested weapon, my parents' blind, suffocating love for their golden boy. He drove to my childhood home in Philadelphia, burst through the front door, and broke down in artificial, heaving sobs. He spun a masterful web of lies for Aiden and Beatrice. He claimed that Stella's vindictive, spiteful legal trap had frozen his assets and that he was going to be sent to federal prison for a minor clerical error regarding a business loan. He begged them for a temporary bailout, swearing on his life that he had a multi-million-dollar shipping contract finalizing in Boston by the end of the quarter. My parents, utterly incapable of seeing the monster they had created, did the unthinkable. Without consulting a financial advisor, a lawyer, or even Aunt Patricia, Aidan and Beatrice marched into their local bank. They took out a massive home equity line of credit, HELOC, on their primary residence, the modest, three-bedroom home they had spent 30 arduous years paying off. It was their sanctuary, their nest egg, their only real tangible asset in the world. They drained $250,000 of hard-earned equity and wired it directly to Thomas. They genuinely believed he was just a misunderstood genius having a temporary cash flow problem, Aunt Patricia whispered, shaking her head as she stirred her iced tea. Your mother told me she was proud to invest in her son's future when his own sister wouldn't, but Thomas didn't pay off Victor Sterling. The debt to the syndicate had ballooned with penalties, and $250,000 wasn't enough to clear his name and maintain his lavish lifestyle. So, Thomas took my parents' 30 years of equity and threw it into the digital casino. He poured the entire $250,000 into a highly volatile, leveraged cryptocurrency margin trade, convinced he could double the money overnight, pay off Sterling, and return the funds to my parents before the bank's first repayment cycle hit. The market tanked 3 days later. A sudden, brutal flash crash wiped out his entire portfolio. The $250,000 vanished into the digital ether in less than 48 hours. By Thanksgiving, the financial rot was fully exposed to the harsh light of day, and the dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Victor Sterling's lawyers initiated aggressive legal proceedings to seize Thomas's remaining physical assets. The fraud unit of the state police, alerted by several of Thomas's burned investors, officially opened a criminal investigation into the forged financial documents he had used to secure his initial lines of credit. He was unceremoniously evicted from his luxury penthouse, his belongings left in garbage bags on the sidewalk. The leased Range Rover was repossessed by a tow truck in the dead of night. But the hardest, most devastating blow landed squarely on the shoulders of Aidan and Beatrice. Because they had leveraged their primary home on a variable rate HELOC, and because they had entirely exhausted their meager savings to hire a criminal defense attorney for Thomas, they could no longer afford their own monthly mortgage payments. They were living on a fixed retirement income that barely covered their groceries, let alone a massive new debt burden. In January, as the bitter winter wind howled through Philadelphia, the bank initiated formal foreclosure proceedings on my childhood home. When I read the frantic email from Aunt Patricia detailing the foreclosure, I sat completely still at my mahogany desk for a long time. I felt a heavy, complicated knot forming in my stomach. A younger, weaker, more desperate version of Stella would have swooped in. She would have written a massive check. She would have paid off the bank, saved the family home, and begged for a single crumb of their gratitude. But that Stella had died the day her parents handed the keys of her heart over to a grifter. I forwarded the email to my corporate attorney, Simon Caldwell, instructing him to ensure my personal and business assets were legally firewalled from my family's impending bankruptcy. Then, I deleted the email and went back to work. By late February, reality had finally cornered my parents. Their credit scores were decimated. The bank officially took possession of the Philadelphia property, giving them 30 days to vacate. They had absolutely nowhere to go. They couldn't qualify to rent a one-bedroom apartment. Thomas was sleeping on a friend's couch, facing an impending grand jury indictment, completely useless to them. They had only one option left, the ultimate, bitter, inescapable irony. They had to utilize the life estate. On a miserable, freezing Tuesday in March, an unrelenting rain washing over the East Coast, Aidan and Beatrice packed whatever prized possessions they could fit into a rented U-Haul van. They drove silently down the Garden State Parkway, carrying the heavy, humiliating weight of their own disastrous choices, and moved into the Cape May house. The house I had painstakingly renovated for them. The house they had rudely rejected. The house they had tried to give away to my brother. Now, it was their only refuge from homelessness. They were trapped in a luxurious, $425,000 oceanfront mansion that they couldn't afford to heat properly, couldn't borrow a single dime against, and couldn't legally sell. They were entirely reliant on my father's Social Security checks just to keep the lights on and buy generic groceries to cook in the custom Carrera marble chef's kitchen. Every single time they sat on the mahogany porch, shivering in their sweaters, they were forced to remember exactly how they got there. They were surrounded by the physical, undeniable manifestation of the daughter they had discarded, completely reliant on her legal trap just to keep a roof over their heads. Henry and I, meanwhile, were flourishing. My real estate firm closed its most profitable quarter in history. We celebrated with a 2-week, unplugged vacation to the Amalfi Coast, drinking wine and watching the Mediterranean sunset. I felt a profound, unshakable sense of peace. But the story wasn't quite over, because Thomas, in his infinite, arrogant stupidity, wasn't done trying to cheat the system. And his final, most desperate grift was about to bring the police flashing lights right to the front door of that beautiful coastal home. Spring turned into summer, and Cape May awakened. The quiet coastal town transformed into a bustling haven for wealthy vacationers. For my parents, however, the arrival of the summer season only magnified their misery. They were living in a $425,000 masterpiece, yet they were entirely dependent on my father's meager Social Security checks to cover groceries and the base utilities. They couldn't afford to run the central air conditioning I had so carefully installed. They sat on the wraparound mahogany porch, sweltering in the July heat, watching luxury cars roll past, trapped in a gilded cage of their own making. And then came the 4th of July weekend. I was at home in Philadelphia, hosting a backyard barbecue with Henry and a few close friends, when my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the local number for the Cape May Police Department. I stepped away from the grill, a familiar, cold dread creeping up my spine, and answered. "Is this Stella Bennett?" a gruff voice asked. "This is Sergeant Miller with the Cape May Police. We're currently responding to a disturbance at a property on Ocean Avenue. County records list you as the primary deed holder." "Yes, that's my property," I said, my heart rate accelerating. "My parents, Aidan and Beatrice Gallagher, hold a life estate and reside there. Is everything all right? Are they hurt?" "They aren't hurt, ma'am, but we have a massive situation on the lawn." Sergeant Miller sighed, the sound of shouting echoing in the background. "We currently have 3 separate families from New York and Connecticut standing in the driveway with luggage. All 3 families possess signed lease agreements stating they rented this house for the month of July. They each wired $10,000 to a man named Thomas Gallagher, who claimed to be the property manager." I closed my eyes, leaning my forehead against the cool siding of my house. Thomas. He couldn't sell the house, he couldn't leverage the house, so he had decided to illegally rent it out from under his own parents. Desperate for cash to flee the state before his impending indictment for his previous financial frauds, Thomas had stolen the high-resolution photos from Sylvia Brentwood's aborted real estate listing. He had created fake profiles on premium vacation rental sites, advertising the Gallagher Seaside retreat. Knowing peak season rentals in Cape May commanded exorbitant prices, he double and triple booked the property, demanding full payment up front via non-refundable wire transfers to an offshore account. He knew my parents were living there. He simply didn't care. He took the cash and vanished, leaving Aidan and Beatrice to face the fallout. "Sergeant Miller," I said, my voice eerily calm. "I am the sole owner. I have never authorized any rental of that property. Thomas Gallagher is my brother, and he is currently under investigation by the State Fraud Unit for unrelated crimes. My parents are victims of his scam, just like the people in the driveway." It took 3 hours for the police to clear the scene. The swindled families were furious, threatening lawsuits and screaming obscenities. Wealthy neighbors stepped out onto their pristine porches, watching the humiliating spectacle unfold as police cruisers flashed their blue and red lights against the darkening summer sky. Aidan and Beatrice were forced to stand on the lawn, weeping in front of the entire neighborhood, explaining to angry strangers and police officers that their son was a con artist who had robbed everyone. That was the breaking point, the absolute, undeniable end of the delusion. The police tracked the wire transfers to a motel in Atlantic City. 2 days later, Thomas was arrested by state troopers. He was found sitting in a dingy room surrounded by empty liquor bottles and a laptop. Because he had crossed state lines to defraud the renting families, federal wire fraud charges were added to his already staggering list of state-level offenses. When Thomas went to trial the following year, the evidence was overwhelming. He had defrauded investors, predatory lenders, and innocent vacationers. The judge showed zero leniency, sentencing him to 7 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. My parents didn't attend the sentencing. They couldn't afford the gas money to drive up to the courthouse. Aunt Patricia called me a few months later to give me the final update. "They don't speak about him anymore, Stella," she said softly over the phone. "Beatrice took all of his photographs off the mantle. They just sit in that big, beautiful house you bought them, staring at the ocean. They are entirely alone, and they know exactly why. I didn't rejoice in their suffering. I felt a profound, hollow sadness for the family I never really had, but I also felt a fierce, protective peace regarding the life I had built with Henry. I had given my parents the ultimate test, and they had failed it spectacularly. But in doing so, they had finally set me free. They remain in Cape May to this day. They keep the house meticulously clean, terrified that any violation of the HOA rules might give me legal grounds to dissolve the life estate and evict them. They live in constant, quiet fear of the daughter they once treated as an afterthought. I still pay the property taxes. I still pay the homeowner's insurance. But I have never returned their calls, and I have never driven down to see them. The house was meant to be a sanctuary. Instead, it became a monument to their greed, a daily reminder of the son who ruined them, and the daughter they threw away. I spent my life trying to buy my parents' love, but ultimately, I only bought their reality check. The Cape May house remains theirs to use, a stunning, oceanfront prison built entirely from their own betrayal. Karma didn't just knock on their door, it handed them the keys and forced them to live inside. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge is simply stepping back and letting toxic people destroy themselves.